Millionaire rescues homeless family. Then shocking truth about their identity turns his world upside down. Alexander Rothschild, at 42, stood atop the gleaming skyscraper that bore his family name, surveying the sprawling New York skyline. The setting sun bathed the steel and glass towers in a golden glow, a fitting backdrop for a man whose life revolved around wealth, power, and unshakable control. Born into a legacy of old money, Alexander had shattered expectations, multiplying his inheritance many times over with shrewd investments and ruthless business tactics. Impeccably dressed in a tailored Armani suit, he emanated an aura of absolute authority, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the cold efficiency that defined him. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Epic Story Moments. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Like, share, and comment to support more incredible stories like this. Despite his financial success, Alexander carried a gnawing emptiness deep within, a void no amount of money could ever fill. Raised by emotionally distant parents who prized social status over genuine affection, he had grown into a man who valued results over relationships. His romantic endeavors were fleeting, calculated, and devoid of emotional entanglements, leaving behind a reputation as the Ice King among New York's elite. Few truly knew him, and fewer still dared to cross him. As the final rays of sunlight vanished below the horizon, Alexander's phone buzzed, pulling him from his introspection. It was a reminder from his assistant about the charity gala he was expected to attend that evening, a gaudy affair masquerading as altruism, in his opinion. He sighed and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Maintaining appearances was non-negotiable in his world. Little did he know, this night would be unlike any other, unraveling his carefully constructed life and forcing him to confront truths he had long buried. Across town, in a grimy alley far removed from Manhattan's glittering high-rises, Sarah clutched her crying infant close to her chest, her body trembling from the cold and despair. Her tear-streaked face, framed by unkempt hair, told a story of unrelenting hardship. Beside her, a wide-eyed boy of about 5 clung to the hem of her threadbare coat, his expression a haunting mixture of fear and confusion. Once, Sarah had dreamed of becoming a doctor. She had been bright, ambitious, and full of hope. But a series of relentless tragedies, an accident, mounting debt, and betrayal by those she trusted, had led her here, homeless and destitute. With no one to turn to, Sarah felt the crushing weight of failure pressing down on her. Tonight, she stood at a crossroads, ready to make a desperate choice that would ripple across her life and others in ways she could never have foreseen. Meanwhile, Alexander's limousine glided through the streets, delivering him to the grand doors of the charity gala. Fashionably late as always, he entered the opulent ballroom with effortless poise. The room sparkled with crystal chandeliers and glittering designer gowns, the air thick with the scent of wealth and exclusivity. Champagne flutes clinked, laughter echoed, and conversations buzzed with talk of stock market surges and high-profile mergers. Alexander navigated the sea of opulence with practiced indifference, exchanging hollow pleasantries and business cards. "Alex, darling," a shrill voice pierced through the ambient noise. He turned, his smile tightening as he faced Vivian Hartley, a notorious socialite whose scandals were far more memorable than her philanthropy. Draped in a gown that likely cost more than most people's annual salaries, she sauntered toward him with an exaggerated air of entitlement. "I was starting to think you'd abandoned us," Vivian teased, her voice dripping with faux warmth. "Vivian, always a pleasure," Alexander replied smoothly, his expression unreadable. "You know I wouldn't miss the chance to support such a worthy cause." Their conversation was cut short by a commotion at the entrance. A disheveled woman stumbled into the room, clutching an infant tightly to her chest. It was Sarah. Her wide, terrified eyes darted around the room as murmurs of confusion and disdain spread like wildfire among the guests. Alexander froze, his gaze locking on the scene as a wave of unease rippled through him. Something about her struck a chord he couldn't quite identify. The universe, it seemed, was aligning to tear down the walls he had spent his life constructing. What Alexander didn't yet realize was that the woman before him held a truth capable of shattering not just his carefully guarded identity, but his very understanding of humanity itself. As Vivian launched into a detailed account of her recent cosmetic procedures, Alexander's mind began to wander. He found himself questioning the authenticity of everything around him. The fake smiles, the hollow conversations, the pretense of caring about causes that most attendees would forget about by morning. Excusing himself from Vivian's company, he stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air. The cool night breeze was a welcome respite from the stifling atmosphere inside. As he loosened his bow tie, his gaze fell upon the streets below, where the city's less fortunate continued their daily struggle for survival, oblivious to the opulence just a few stories above them. It was at that moment a commotion near the hotel entrance caught his attention. Squinting, he made out the figure of a young woman, disheveled and clearly distressed, trying to push past the doorman. In her arms was a bundle that Alexander quickly realized was an infant. Behind her, clinging to her leg, stood a small boy. Intrigued and unsettled by the scene, Alexander made his way back to the ballroom and down to the lobby. As he approached the entrance, the woman's desperate pleas grew clearer. "Please, I just need help. I don't know what else to do," she cried, her voice cracking with emotion. The doormen, looking uncomfortable but resolute, were firmly but gently trying to escort her away. "I'm sorry, miss, but you can't come in here. This is a private event," one of them said. Alexander felt an unfamiliar tug at his conscience. Before he could fully process what he was doing, he found himself striding toward the group. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his authoritative tone causing the doorman to step back respectfully. The woman turned to Alexander, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "Please, sir, I don't have anywhere else to go. My babies, they're hungry and it's so cold outside. I just need some help. Just for tonight." Alexander studied her face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the desperation etched into every line. His gaze shifted to the infant in her arms, then to the young boy hiding behind her legs. The boy's small face was a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. In that moment, something shifted within Alexander. Perhaps it was the stark contrast between the extravagance he had just left and the raw humanity before him. Or maybe it was a long-dormant part of himself awakening after years of emotional detachment. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Sarah," she replied, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "And this is Emma," she said, nodding to the baby. "And Jack," she added, gesturing to the boy. Alexander took a deep breath, knowing his next words would irrevocably change the course of his evening, and possibly much more. "All right, Sarah, come with me." Ignoring the startled looks from the doormen and the curious glances from other guests, Alexander led Sarah and the children to his waiting limousine. As they settled into the plush leather seats, Sarah looked around in disbelief. Alexander instructed his driver to take them to his penthouse. As the car pulled away from the curb, Alexander caught his reflection in the window. The face looking back at him seemed different somehow, as if the simple act of kindness had already begun to thaw something long frozen within him. Little did he know that this impulsive decision would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and the world he inhabited. The ride to Alexander's penthouse was a study in contrasts. The opulent interior of the limousine stood in stark opposition to Sarah's worn clothing and the children's wide-eyed wonder. Alexander found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guests, a mixture of curiosity and unease settling in his stomach. As they ascended in the private elevator to the top floor of his building, Alexander's mind raced. What had possessed him to bring these strangers into his home? He, who prided himself on calculated decisions and emotional detachment, had acted on pure impulse. The elevator doors opened directly into his sprawling penthouse, and Sarah gasped audibly. The space was a testament to wealth and minimalist design, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," Alexander said, gesturing toward the living area. "I'll get you some water and see what I can find in terms of food." As he busied himself in the kitchen, he could hear Sarah's hushed voice comforting the children. The domestic sounds were alien in his usually silent home, and he found them oddly comforting. Returning with a tray of water, some fruit, and hastily assembled sandwiches, Alexander found Sarah perched on the edge of his designer sofa, looking utterly out of place. Jack was exploring the room with cautious curiosity, while Emma slept peacefully in her mother's arms. "Thank you," Sarah said softly as she accepted a glass of water. I don't know how to repay your kindness." Alexander simply shook his head. "You don't have to." Alexander waved away her gratitude, feeling uncomfortable with the raw emotion in her voice. "It's nothing," he said, his tone clipped. "Now, perhaps you could tell me how you came to be in this situation." Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she began to speak. Alexander listened intently, his world tilting on its axis with every word. She spoke of a life that seemed worlds away from his own, of growing up in foster care, dreams deferred by an unexpected pregnancy, and an abusive relationship she had barely escaped. "Jack isn't mine biologically," she confessed, her voice breaking as her eyes filled with tears. "His mother was my best friend. She didn't make it out. I couldn't leave him behind." As Sarah's story unfolded, Alexander found himself experiencing emotions he had long thought buried: compassion, anger on her behalf, and a growing sense of shame at his own privileged attachment from the harsh realities so many faced. But it was when Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out a crumpled photograph that Alexander's world truly shattered. The faded image showed a younger Sarah standing next to a woman who could have been her sister. In the background, Alexander's gaze caught a face he recognized with a jolt: his own father. "This was taken at the children's home where I grew up," Sarah explained, oblivious to Alexander's shock. "That woman next to me, she always claimed she knew my real parents, that they were wealthy people who had to give me up. I never believed her. I thought it was just a kind lie to make us feel better." Alexander's mind reeled. The timing, the resemblance, it was all too coincidental. Could it be possible? Did he have a half-sister he had never known about? The weight of this revelation settled over him, shaking the foundations of his carefully ordered world. As Alexander stared at the photograph, the walls of his isolated existence began to crumble, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for what lay beyond them. He found himself at a crossroads, facing a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. On one hand, he could dismiss this as mere coincidence, send Sarah and the children on their way with some money, and retreat into his familiar world of high finance and emotional detachment. But as he looked at Sarah's hopeful face and the innocent eyes of Jack and Emma, he knew he couldn't take the easy way out. Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. "Sarah," he began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "there's something I need to tell you. I think we might be related." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief as Alexander explained his suspicions, pointing out the resemblance and the timing that aligned with his father's known indiscretions. "I can't be certain without a DNA test," he concluded, "but I believe there's a strong possibility that we share a father." Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind struggling to process the revelation. The idea that her biological family might have been within reach all this time, that she might have a brother who was a millionaire, seemed too fantastical to be true. "If this is true," Alexander continued, his business-like demeanor reasserting itself, "it changes everything. I want to help you, Sarah, not just for tonight, but permanently. We can get the DNA test done, and regardless of the results, I'll make sure you and the children are taken care of." The offer hung between them, a lifeline Sarah had never dared to hope for. But as the initial shock wore off, doubt began to creep in. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this for us?" Alexander paused, realizing he needed to confront emotions he had long kept buried. Because, he said slowly, I've spent my entire life building walls around myself, convinced that success and wealth were all that mattered. But seeing you tonight, hearing your story, it's made me realize how empty my life has been. Whether you're my sister or not, helping you feels like the right thing to do. Perhaps the only right thing I've done in a long time. As the weight of his decision settled over him, Alexander began to grapple with its consequences. He knew that opening this door would invite scrutiny into his family's past, potentially unearthing scandals that could damage the Rothschild name. His father, though long deceased, had carefully cultivated an image of success and respectability, an image that could now be shattered. The trail of obscure financial dealings, James stumbled upon something alarming. Buried deep within the records were sizable donations made to organizations that appeared, on the surface, to be charitable. However, further investigation revealed anomalies, untraceable funds, overlapping board memberships, and vague reports about the use of the money. It didn't take long for James to suspect that these charities might be fronts for illegal activities. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If his hunch was correct, this discovery could not only implicate the Rothschild name in criminal activity, but also provide him with leverage to rise through the ranks. However, he knew he had to tread carefully. Exposing something of this magnitude could make him powerful enemies. The next morning, as Alexander prepared to meet with Sarah and outline the steps ahead, the pieces of these seemingly unrelated events were beginning to align. Detective Maria Gonzalez arrived at the Rothschild Foundation offices, her badge tucked discreetly inside her coat. She requested a meeting with the foundation's director, a polished woman named Evelyn Harrington, who greeted Maria with a carefully practiced smile. "What brings the NYPD to our offices this morning?" Evelyn asked, her tone polite but guarded. "I'm following up on some financial transactions linked to organizations you supported," Maria replied evenly, studying Evelyn's reaction. "Just routine due diligence." Evelyn's smile didn't waver, but her fingers tensed slightly on the edge of her desk. "Of course. We pride ourselves on transparency here. If you'll give me a list of the transactions in question, I'd be happy to provide any documentation you need." Maria nodded but didn't hand over any specifics. "I'll be in touch," she said, rising to leave. As she walked out, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the Rothschild Foundation than met the eye. Back at the Rothschild mansion, Alexander sat with Sarah over breakfast, laying out the plan for the day. He had already arranged for a DNA testing kit to be delivered, and a suite in a luxury apartment complex was being prepared for Sarah and the children. Yet beneath his calm demeanor, Alexander felt a gnawing unease. The photograph in Sarah's story had shaken him, but now he found himself wondering what other secrets his father had taken to the grave, and how they might come back to haunt him. Later that evening, James Hawthorne's investigation took a more personal turn. As he delved deeper into the questionable transactions, he found something that stopped him cold. A series of payments tied to one of the suspect charities had been authorized years ago by none other than Alexander Rothschild. While it was possible Alexander had no idea where the money was going, James couldn't ignore the implications. If this information got out, it could not only ruin Alexander's reputation, but also jeopardize the entire Rothschild empire. James hesitated. Should he confront Alexander directly, or use his knowledge as a stepping stone for his own ambitions? The decision weighed heavily on him, especially as he realized the potential danger of exposing such a powerful family's secrets. Meanwhile, Sarah was beginning to feel the weight of her own situation. While she was grateful for Alexander's help, she couldn't shake the nagging suspicion that there was more to his sudden kindness than met the eye. Was it genuine, or was he motivated by guilt? And what would happen if the DNA test revealed they weren't related after all? She didn't want to depend on charity, even from someone as seemingly altruistic as Alexander. As the threads of their lives became increasingly tangled, a new complication arose. Detective Gonzalez, determined to dig deeper into the Rothschild Foundation's activities, uncovered a lead that tied one of the suspect charities to a high-profile gala Alexander was set to host the following week. She decided to attend undercover, hoping to gather evidence and perhaps confront Alexander himself if the opportunity arose. For Alexander, the upcoming gala was yet another reminder of the precarious balance he was trying to maintain. He needed to uphold his public image, while privately unraveling the mysteries Sarah had brought into his life. But as the event approached, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world he had so meticulously built was on the brink of collapse. Unbeknownst to everyone involved, the gala would become the crucible where all these converging storylines would come to a head, revealing secrets, testing loyalties, and forcing Alexander to confront not only his family's past, but also the man he wanted to become. Change in Alexander was both surprising and heartening. She saw glimpses of a man who was not just defined by his wealth and power, but also by an emerging sense of humanity and vulnerability. It was a side of him she suspected even he hadn't fully explored before. The children, too, were beginning to warm up to Alexander. Jack, who had initially been wary, now eagerly shared stories about his favorite superheroes, while little Emma had taken to following Alexander around the house, her tiny footsteps echoing his in a way that made him smile despite himself. But beneath the surface, tensions were brewing. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her street-hardened instincts told her that Alexander's interest in her past wasn't solely out of kindness, and she noticed the subtle shifts in his demeanor whenever he thought she wasn't watching. Moments of hesitation, fleeting glances of worry. She wondered if he was hiding something, and if so, what it could be. Meanwhile, across the city, Detective Gonzalez was making progress in her investigation. After days of piecing together clues, she was beginning to uncover a web of connections between the Rothschild Foundation and the suspected trafficking ring. The Foundation's charitable donations to certain organizations had funded more than just social programs. Gonzalez was sure of it, but without solid evidence, she couldn't make her case stick. She needed a break, something concrete to expose the individuals behind the operation. That break came unexpectedly. A whistleblower from within the Rothschild Foundation contacted her anonymously, claiming to have information that could blow the case wide open. Gonzalez arranged to meet the informant in a public park, her instincts on high alert. When she arrived, a young woman nervously handed her a small stack of documents before quickly disappearing into the crowd. As Gonzalez reviewed the papers, her eyes widened. The documents implicated not only several high-ranking individuals in the trafficking ring, but also hinted at financial ties to Rothschild Enterprises itself. Back at Rothschild Enterprises, James Hawthorne was also on the brink of a revelation. The files he had copied onto his thumb drive painted a damning picture of systematic corruption within the company's financial operations. But what caught his attention most was a set of payments linked directly to Alexander Rothschild's accounts. James was torn. Did Alexander know about this, or was he an unwitting participant in something far bigger than himself? James decided he needed to confront Alexander, but he wasn't sure how. If Alexander was involved, exposing him could cost James everything. But if Alexander was innocent, he might be the only person with the power to bring the truth to light. As these parallel investigations closed in, Alexander remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. He was too preoccupied with his new responsibilities as a surrogate father figure to Jack and Emma. He found himself smiling more, laughing even, as he learned to navigate the chaos of bedtime stories, spilled milk, and impromptu living room dance parties. For the first time in years, his life felt meaningful. One evening, as Alexander tucked the children into bed, Sarah approached him with a tentative smile. "You're getting good at this," she said, nodding toward the kids' room. Alexander chuckled. "I think they're just being kind to me. I have no idea what I'm doing." "You're doing better than you think," Sarah said softly. "Thank you for all of this. I don't know where we'd be without you." Alexander looked at her, his expression serious. "You don't owe me any thanks, Sarah. If anything, I owe you You've given me a purpose I didn't know I was missing." Their quiet moment was interrupted by the buzzing of Alexander's phone. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It was a message from James, requesting an urgent meeting. Alexander's mind raced. James rarely contacted him directly, and the tone of the message suggested it was something serious. The next day, as Alexander sat across from James in his office, he couldn't help but feel a pang of unease. James slid the thumb drive across the desk, his expression grim. "You need to see this," he said. Alexander plugged the drive into his laptop and began scrolling through the files. As the scope of what James had uncovered became clear, Alexander felt his stomach drop. The financial irregularities, the charitable donations linked to criminal activity, it was all there, implicating not just his company but potentially his own name. "I don't know if you were aware of this," James said cautiously, "but if this gets out, it could destroy everything." Alexander sat back, his mind reeling. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. Not only was his family legacy at risk, but so was the newfound sense of purpose he had found with Sarah and the children. He realized that the choices he made in the coming days would define not just his future, but the lives of everyone around him. As the city's glittering skyline loomed outside his window, Alexander resolved to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Little did he know, the journey ahead would force him to confront the darkest corners of his family's past and make sacrifices he never thought possible. Man stepped into the room, his expression solemn. "Mr. Rothschild," he began, his voice steady, but carrying an undeniable weight. "There's much more at play here than you realize." He glanced at the detective and then back to Alexander, his gaze sharp with an urgency that made everyone in the room freeze. Alexander's heart began to race. "Wilson, what are you talking about?" he asked, feeling an unsettling sense of dread settle over him. The calmness that had once characterized his life was rapidly unraveling. Wilson hesitated for a moment, seemingly weighing whether to speak. Then, with a resigned sigh, he placed an envelope on the desk in front of Alexander. This is from your father's old files. It contains information that was meant to stay buried, but I can no longer keep it hidden." He looked toward Detective Gonzalez before continuing, his voice soft yet heavy with meaning. "The Rothschild Foundation and everything connected to it has ties to a network far more dangerous than you can imagine." Alexander's eyes narrowed. His thoughts raced as he glanced at Sarah, who was now standing beside him, holding on to Jack with a protective air. Her brow furrowed in confusion and worry, but she remained silent, sensing the gravity of the situation. The detective leaned forward, taking the envelope from the desk and opening it slowly, her professional demeanor faltering for just a moment as she examined its contents. "This," she said, her voice sharp, "could change everything." Inside the envelope were a series of photographs, confidential documents, and handwritten notes. The documents revealed connections between the Rothschild Foundation and individuals who had been under investigation for years, linked to human trafficking, money laundering, and other illegal operations. The photographs were even more damning, showing a younger Alexander, his father, and a few prominent business figures at high-profile events, an appearance that had been intentionally misrepresented in the public eye. Wilson turned to Alexander, his voice now tinged with regret. "Your father was involved in things he was trying to hide. The foundation wasn't just a philanthropic venture. It was a tool for laundering money, and there's more. These documents implicate not only your father, but others within your company." The revelation hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. His father, the man who had built the Rothschild empire, whose image had been carefully crafted to appear as a philanthropist, was involved in dark dealings that spanned far beyond what Alexander had ever known. "No," Alexander muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. "This can't be true. This is some kind of mistake." Detective Gonzalez, now holding the photographs up to the light, looked at Alexander with sympathy. "I wish it were, but it's all here. The foundation was a cover, a way to move money. Your family's legacy, Alexander. It's tangled in this mess." Sarah, standing behind him, felt a cold rush of fear, her mind working quickly to make sense of the situation. "So what does this mean for us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she tried to hold it together for the children's sake. "It means," Gonzalez said, her eyes narrowing with determination, "that we have a lot of work ahead of us. Your family's involvement goes beyond donations. We're talking about years of hidden activity and systemic corruption." She turned to James, who had been standing off to the side, still processing everything that was unfolding. "And you, Mr. Hawthorne, have been sitting on these files? You knew something wasn't right and didn't bring it forward." James, looking defeated, muttered, "I didn't know the full extent of it, but I've been trying to uncover what's been going on with the Foundation's donations. I never imagined it would be this deep." The tension in the room was palpable, each person unsure of who to trust anymore. Alexander felt his world spinning out of control. He had always prided himself on the control he had over his life, but now it seemed like that control was slipping away. Wilson stepped forward once more. "There's more I haven't told you, Alexander. Your father, he had business with people you don't want to get involved with. Dangerous people. If this goes public, your family's life, will be at risk." The words hit hard, and Alexander could feel the weight of his family's safety pressing down on him. He couldn't let this ruin everything he had built, everything he had come to care about, especially Sarah and the children. His mind raced, thoughts colliding with each other as he tried to come up with a plan, a way to protect them all. "I need time to think," he said, standing abruptly. "Sarah, James, detective, please, give me a moment." As the room cleared, Sarah remained at his side, her hand on his arm. She looked at him with concern. "We're in this together, Alexander. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family." Alexander gave a tight smile, though his heart was heavy. "I don't know if I can protect you from this," he whispered, "but I'll try. I swear I will." As he looked down at the children, oblivious to the storm swirling around them, he knew that the path ahead would be perilous. But for Sarah and the kids, he would face whatever came next. No matter what, the battle for truth, family, and survival had only just begun. Short of catastrophic, a public confession would expose your family's darkest secrets to the world. Alexander, his jaw set with determination, turned to his lawyer, his voice resolute. "I understand the risks, but the longer we wait, the more control we lose. This has gone on for too long, and we need to own our truth before it's twisted by others." Sarah, standing quietly by his side, looked at him with a mix of gratitude and fear. "Are you sure about this, Alex?" Her voice was soft, but the weight of her words hung in the air. "Once it's out there, we can't take it back." Alexander took a deep breath, looking at her with a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. "I know, Sarah, but we've been living in the shadows long enough. It's time to step into the light, even if it means facing the consequences. We'll do this together." The room fell silent as the implications of his words settled in. James Hawthorne, who had been pacing nervously in the corner, spoke up. "I'll handle the media relations. I can help mitigate the damage. We need a controlled narrative." Detective Gonzalez, still processing everything, nodded in agreement. "This won't be easy. There will be a lot of questions, and a lot of people won't believe your intentions. But if you're ready to move forward, I'll be here to help you clear your name." Wilson, standing off to the side, watched as the weight of Alexander's decision seemed to shift the energy in the room. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "Mr. Rothschild, I know this won't be easy, but I believe you're doing the right thing. Your father's mistakes don't define you. You have a chance to change the legacy." For a moment, Alexander allowed himself to process the enormity of what lay ahead. The foundation he had worked so hard to build, the family he had come to cherish, would all be under intense scrutiny. But in his heart, he knew it was the only way forward. He had to face the truth, no matter how painful it would be, and reclaim the future for himself and those he loved. Later that evening, the press conference was set. The room was filled with reporters, cameras, and microphones, all aimed at the Rothschild family's carefully constructed empire, which now seemed to be crumbling before their eyes. Alexander stood at the podium, his posture strong but his heart pounding in his chest. Beside him were Sarah, Wilson, and Detective Gonzalez, each person standing as a silent testament to the gravity of the moment. As the first questions came, Alexander's voice remained calm, though his nerves simmered beneath the surface. "Good evening," he began, meeting the gaze of the reporters with a steady gaze. "I know the story you've heard up until now is one of scandal, secrecy, and betrayal, but I'm here to set the record straight." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "My father made choices that have cast a long shadow over our family, choices that I, as a son, can never undo. But the truth is, much of what has been assumed about the Rothschild Foundation, my family, and our dealings is not as it seems. There have been mistakes, grave mistakes, but they were not made with malicious intent. My father's efforts to provide for someone he loved, someone he kept secret for reasons I'm still struggling to understand, have led to these consequences." The room was silent as Alexander continued, his voice gaining strength. "The Rothschild Foundation has never been involved in human trafficking, despite the investigation led by Detective Gonzalez. What we are guilty of is financial mismanagement, poor decisions made to keep a private matter hidden for too long. We are now committed to correcting those mistakes, both publicly and legally." Sarah, standing beside him, stepped forward, her voice steady though it carried a rawness that touched everyone in the room. "I am Sarah Rothschild. I've lived my entire life not knowing my father, trying to understand why he never acknowledged me. Now I know the truth. My father, Richard Rothschild, made choices that affected not just me, but all of us. I am here today not for revenge, but to help my family rebuild, to heal the wounds that have been festering for too long." Alexander gave her a brief, supportive glance before turning back to the reporters. "We are committed to full transparency. Our foundation will undergo a full audit. We will work with law enforcement to ensure that all illicit activities are exposed, and anyone involved in wrongdoing will be held accountable." As the questions flooded in, Alexander felt a strange sense of release. For the first time, he wasn't trying to protect a carefully constructed image. He was simply speaking the truth, the unvarnished truth that had been buried for far too long. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but in that moment, surrounded by the people who had become his true family, Sarah, Wilson, and even Detective Gonzalez, he felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't the end of the Rothschild legacy. It was the beginning of something new, something honest. And though the coming days would be filled with struggle and heartache, Alexander knew one thing for certain: the truth would set them free. As the days passed, the Rothschild family continued to adjust to the sweeping changes Alexander had set in motion. The transformation of Rothschild Enterprises was no longer just a corporate strategy. It was a personal revolution. Alexander's new approach wasn't without its challenges, but with Sarah, the children, and the support of unexpected allies, he was determined to move forward, unafraid of the scrutiny that came with embracing his family's truth. The media had turned their attention to the Rothschilds, but Alexander no longer feared their gaze. The press had shifted from scandalous reports of betrayal to admiration for his honesty and determination. His decision to expose the family's secrets had sparked not only a public reckoning, but also a movement where other business leaders began to reconsider their own legacies and where the public, once skeptical, started to see the Rothschilds as a family that had been willing to face the consequences of their past and rebuild from the ground up. With Detective Gonzalez's help, the human trafficking network that had long been operating under the radar was finally dismantled. The financial connections uncovered during the investigation had created a trail that led straight to some of the city's most influential figures, and with Alexander's assistance, the authorities were able to bring them to justice. It was a win for the victims of the trafficking ring, and it solidified Alexander's reputation as a leader who was willing to put everything on the line for the greater good. But it wasn't just the business world that had taken notice. Communities began to rally around Alexander's vision for a more compassionate future. The Rothschild Foundation, once a symbol of wealth and power, was restructured into a beacon for social justice, with a focus on supporting education, healthcare, and anti-trafficking initiatives. Alexander poured his heart into these efforts, seeing each new project not as a business venture, but as a lifeline for those who had been forgotten by society. As he worked late one evening, reviewing proposals for a new community outreach program, Alexander thought about the person he had been just a year ago, the driven, ambitious CEO whose sole focus had been power and success. He had once been consumed by the need to maintain control, to uphold an image of perfection that had kept his family, his colleagues, and even himself at a distance. Now, as he sat surrounded by plans for reform, he realized that the man he had become was someone who was not only willing to take risks, but also someone who was learning to live with his own vulnerability. In the weeks following the press conference, Alexander found himself reconnecting with people he had long overlooked. Business partners who had once been wary of his leadership came to offer their support. Old friends, too, began reaching out, some with apologies, others with admiration for the changes he was embracing. It was clear that Alexander's journey of self-discovery was resonating with more than just the Rothschilds. People were beginning to see the man beneath the CEO. And in that man, they saw someone who was finally willing to be real. But with all the progress, there were still obstacles ahead. The board of directors, still uncertain of Alexander's shift in priorities, was a source of constant pressure. Some members wanted him to revert to the cutthroat, profit-driven approach that had defined the company's success for decades. But Alexander was resolute. He was willing to sacrifice short-term profits for long-term impact. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he believed that if they could navigate this transition together, they could build something more enduring than wealth. They could create a legacy. One evening, as he sat with Sarah in their newly redecorated living room, Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "But with you, with the kids, and with everyone we brought into this, I believe we can change the world." Sarah smiled, her hand resting on his. "I've always believed in you, Alex. And now I see you, truly see you. We're in this together." The family, once fractured and hidden in the shadows of secrecy, was now united in their shared purpose. Together, they were ready to face whatever the future held, no longer just as a powerful family, but as a force for good. The Rothschild name, once synonymous with privilege and scandal, would now be known for something far greater: redemption, transformation, and a commitment to making a difference in the world. And for Alexander, the journey had only just begun. He had already changed the trajectory of his own life, but now, with every decision, every action, he was changing the course of his family's legacy. He had found a new definition of success, one built not on power and wealth, but on integrity, family, and the courage to embrace the truth. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to walk it. The transformation that had begun with a simple decision to open his home had grown into something much larger than Alexander Rothschild could have ever anticipated. His personal evolution was mirrored in the profound changes happening within his family and his company. It was no longer just about business, wealth, or influence. It was about impact, compassion, and a shared mission for good. Sarah, whose dream of becoming a doctor had once been put on hold, now pursued her pre-med studies with a passion and a confidence she had never known before. Alexander's support had been the catalyst for this shift, and it filled him with pride to see the woman he loved embarking on a path she had always dreamed of. Their shared moments of working together, whether discussing new outreach programs or strategizing for the foundation, were a reminder of how far they had come. One day, as they worked side by side on a new initiative for the foundation, Sarah reflected aloud, "A year ago, I never would have believed this was possible. Not just the education and security, but belonging somewhere, having a family." Alexander smiled, feeling a warmth spread across his chest as he looked at her. "I know exactly what you mean. I had everything money could buy. But I never knew what I was missing until you and the kids came into my life. Their children, Jack and Emma, were thriving in this new environment. Jack, once reserved and shy, was now an energetic and inquisitive boy, fascinated by the world of business. He spent hours asking questions about how things worked at Rothschild Enterprises, eager to learn from his uncle Alex. Emma, though still young, demonstrated a compassion far beyond her years, often accompanying Sarah and Alexander on visits to the shelters and community centers supported by the Rothschild Foundation. Her bright smile and kind heart were a beacon of hope in every room she entered. Even James Hawthorne, the ambitious junior executive who had helped uncover the truth behind the family's secrets, had found a new direction under Alexander's guidance. Alexander recognized James' potential and tasked him with leading a new division focused on corporate transparency and ethical investment, areas that had once seemed secondary to profit but now represented the future of Rothschild Enterprises. Detective Gonzalez, who had become an ally in the fight against human trafficking, often commented on the changes she saw in Alexander. "When I first met you," she told him during one of their strategy meetings, "I thought you were just another rich guy trying to protect his assets. I've never been happier to be proven wrong." Reflecting on the whirlwind of changes, Alexander realized the most profound transformation had been within himself. The walls he had built around his heart, designed to protect him from the loneliness of success, had crumbled. In their place was a connection to the world and people around him that he had never known. He thought back to that fateful night when he had invited Sarah and her children into his home, an act that had seemed like an impulsive gesture at the time. It had set in motion a series of events that not only reshaped his life, but also impacted countless others who benefited from the new mission of the Rothschild Foundation. One evening, as they watched Jack and Emma play in the newly child-proof living room, Sarah mused, "We've come a long way." Alexander nodded, a contented smile on his face. "We have, and we've got a long way to go yet. But for the first time in my life, I'm looking forward to the journey." As night fell over the city, the Rothschild penthouse buzzed with the warmth of family, a stark contrast to the cold, solitary space it had once been. The once distant and isolated Alexander Rothschild, the man who had seemingly everything yet felt empty, now understood the true meaning of richness. He had discovered that wealth was not measured by the number in a bank account, but by the relationships we build and the good we bring into the world. In the years that followed, Rothschild Enterprises became a model for corporate responsibility and ethical business practices. Under the joint leadership of Alexander and Sarah, the Rothschild Foundation spearheaded groundbreaking initiatives in education, healthcare, and social justice. Jack and Emma grew up in an environment that balanced privilege with a deep sense of responsibility, learning from an early age the importance of using their resources to help others. Sarah, now Dr. Sarah Rothschild, divided her time between practicing medicine in underserved communities and guiding the foundation's health initiatives. Alexander, once known as the Ice King of Wall Street, was now often referred to as a philanthropist. He had learned that the greatest satisfaction didn't come from accumulating wealth, but from using it to create lasting, positive change. The Rothschild story became a catalyst for a broader movement in the business world. Other wealthy individuals and corporations began to reconsider their priorities, inspired by Alexander's journey of transformation. The idea of compassionate capitalism, a system where profit and purpose went hand in hand, gained traction in boardrooms and government offices alike. As Alexander stood on the balcony of the penthouse that had once felt so empty, now filled with the warmth of family and purpose, he reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness on a cold night. The city stretched out before him, a landscape of both challenges and opportunities. But now, instead of seeing it as a battlefield for financial conquest, he saw it as a community to nurture and improve. And for the first time, Alexander was no longer alone in that mission. In opening his home and his heart, he had found not only a family, but his true calling. The path ahead was uncertain, but now, with Sarah and their children by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he had the power to create a legacy that would last for generations. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Epic Story Moments. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Like, share, and comment to support more incredible stories like this.